They called him the storm horse, too wild to tame, too dangerous to keep breathing. The steel-gray stallion with the lightning mark across his brow had 24 hours left before a bullet would end what rope and whip could never break. But in the cold shadows of a forgotten mill, a girl nobody wanted was about to do something that would shake the entire town of Crossroads, Montana. What happened next didn't just save one horse. It rewrote everything the town thought they knew about strength, survival, and who deserves a second chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut across the Montana prairie like a blade fresh from the whetstone, sharp enough to sting any exposed skin and cold enough to remind every living thing that winter was no longer a distant threat. It swept through the valley where Crossroads sat wedged between rolling hills and scattered pine forests. A town small enough that everyone knew your business before you did and tight enough that outsiders were noticed the moment their tires hit the county road. The air carried the scent of wood smoke from a dozen chimneys, mixed with the earthier smell of cattle and hay from the Henderson Ranch that sprawled across the western edge of town like a kingdom unto itself. This was a place where handshakes still mattered, where church on Sunday wasn't optional if you wanted to be taken seriously, and where the unwritten rules were enforced more strictly than any law the sheriff could write. It was also a place that had learned to look away from things that made people uncomfortable, and few things made Crossroads more uncomfortable than the girl who lived in the spaces between their neat, orderly lives. The Henderson Ranch had stood for 3 generations, a testament to stubborn survival in a landscape that gave nothing freely. Robert Henderson ran it with the same steady hand his father had used, fair but firm, willing to give a man a chance but quick to cut loose anyone who proved untrustworthy. The main house rose 2 stories high with white paint that had grayed over the years, and a wraparound porch that groaned under the weight of too many Montana winters. Behind it stretched the working heart of the operation, a red barn with white trim that held equipment worth more than most houses in town, corrals and pens arranged in careful geometry, and beyond them the vast stretches of grazing land where Angus cattle moved in dark clusters across the autumn grass. The ranch employed 8 men full-time and twice that during calving season, good jobs in a county where good jobs were scarce as summer rain. Dale Kruger had been foreman for 12 years, a position he wore like armor, and he ran the operation with an iron fist that Robert sometimes had to soften but rarely countermanded. Dale believed in old ways, in dominance and submission, in the clear hierarchy that separated man from beast and made the world make sense. In the far northwest corner of the property, isolated from the other livestock by a good quarter-mile, stood a corral built differently from the rest. Where the cattle pens used simple wooden rails and the horse pastures employed standard wire fencing, this enclosure was reinforced with steel panels bolted together and sunk 3 feet into the ground. The gate was double-latched with chain, and warning signs had been hammered into posts at 3 points around the perimeter. Inside that fortress of metal and warning lived Thunder, and even his name was spoken with a particular tone in Crossroads, the way people talk about natural disasters or family scandals, with a mix of fear and fascination and the secret thrill that comes from proximity to danger. The stallion was steel gray, the color of storm clouds gathering on the horizon, with a coat that seemed to shimmer when he moved and a thick mane that hung wild and tangled no matter how many times someone had tried to tame it. But it was the mark on his forehead that had given him his name, a jagged white blaze shaped exactly like a lightning bolt splitting the sky, running from his forelock down to the bridge of his nose. Some in town called it a sign, though whether of something blessed or cursed depended on who was telling the story. Thunder had come to Henderson Ranch 8 months ago, hauled in on a trailer with sides dented from the inside and a floor stained with blood. The previous owner, a man from over in Billings who thought he knew horses, had tried every method he could find to break the stallion and had the scars to show for his failure. He'd sold Thunder cheap, glad to be rid of him, and Robert had taken him on because the horse's bloodlines were exceptional and because Robert still believed, despite decades of ranching, that some things deserved a chance. That belief had cost the ranch 2 broken ribs when Jake had tried to halter him in the first week, a shattered wrist when Tommy thought he could corner him with a lunge whip, and thousands of dollars in damaged equipment as Thunder systematically destroyed everything within reach of his hooves. The stallion would charge the fence when anyone approached, teeth bared and ears flat against his skull, eyes rolling white with rage that seemed to have no bottom. He would strike at the steel panels with such force that the sound carried all the way to the main house, a rhythmic thunder that gave restless nights to anyone within earshot. The ranch hands had started refusing to go near his pen, and even Dale, who prided himself on never backing down from any animal, had stopped trying to prove his dominance after Thunder had come within inches of ending him. By late October, the conversation had started. Quiet at first, just murmurs in the bunkhouse and careful suggestions during morning coffee, but growing louder as autumn deepened and the reality settled in that winter was coming, and they couldn't afford to feed and maintain a horse that served no purpose except to remind everyone of their failure. Dale pushed hardest, presenting it as simple economics and ranch safety, arguing that keeping Thunder was sentimental foolishness that Robert couldn't afford. Patricia Henderson had argued against it, saying the horse had been traumatized and needed time. But even she had grown quieter as the weeks passed and Thunder showed no sign of anything but escalating fury. By the first week of November, Robert had made the decision that sat heavy in his chest but seemed inevitable. Dr. Ellen Briggs would come Saturday morning at dawn, before the ranch hands started their day, and she would do what needed to be done. It was humane, Robert told himself. It was merciful. It was the only choice left. But the weight of it followed him through his days and kept him staring at the ceiling through long nights, because some part of him knew that putting down Thunder felt less like mercy and more like surrender. Iris Whitman moved through Crossroads the way smoke moves through a room, present but insubstantial, noticed only when someone happened to look directly at the space she occupied. She was 12 years old, though most people in town would have guessed younger because hunger has a way of stealing size along with strength, leaving behind a frame that seemed too small to carry the weight of everything she endured. Her hair hung long and tangled, dark brown shot through with lighter streaks from too much sun and not enough care, and her clothes were a patchwork of wrong sizes and wrong seasons, a flannel shirt 3 times too big over a t-shirt that had once been white, jeans held up with a length of rope because the button had fallen off months ago, and a pair of sneakers so worn that her socks showed through holes in the canvas. She had her father's eyes, deep brown and watchful, and her mother's stubborn chin, though no one in Crossroads remembered either parent well enough to make the connection. They had been drifters who'd stayed a season 2 years back, working odd jobs and living in a camper that broke down more than it ran, and when they died in a rollover on Highway 89 during a spring ice storm, their daughter had simply slipped through the cracks of a system that had too many cracks and not enough people who cared to patch them. Social services had come, of course, asked questions and filled out forms, but Iris had run before they could place her anywhere, some instinct telling her that the system's version of safety would be its own kind of prison. She'd been living rough ever since, sleeping in the hayloft of the old grain mill that had shut down in the 90s and stood empty at the eastern edge of town, its windows broken and its machinery rusted into abstract sculptures. The mill sat near Willow Creek, which ran year-round and gave her water to drink and wash in when she could stand the cold. She'd made a nest of sorts in the loft, old burlap sacks layered for cushioning, and a wool blanket she'd found in a donation box behind the church, moth-eaten but warm enough when she curled tight. During the day she moved through town in a careful pattern designed to avoid attention while meeting basic needs, waiting behind the diner for Grace Paulson to put out the morning scraps, slipping into the library when it was warm enough inside to justify the risk of being told to leave, ducking into alleys when she saw Sheriff Colton's patrol car because he'd made clear that vagrant children reflected poorly on Crossroads and he wouldn't tolerate it. The other kids were worse than the adults in some ways because they were creative with their cruelty. Brett Connors and his friends had turned tormenting Iris into a kind of sport, chasing her with rocks and preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Insults, calling her names that cut deeper than the stones. Dumpster girl, rat, stray. She'd learned to run fast and hide well, learned which fences had loose boards, and which shop owners would let her slip through their back doors when the chase got too close. But running only worked for so long, and every escape just meant delaying the next encounter. The adults mostly pretended she didn't exist, which was its own kind of violence, the way their eyes would slide past her as if she were furniture or shadow, the way conversations would pause when she got too close and resume when she'd moved on, the careful maintenance of a collective fiction that if they didn't acknowledge her she wasn't really their problem. Only Grace at the diner showed any consistent kindness, setting aside food that was still good but couldn't be served, leaving it in a box by the back door where Iris knew to check. Even that charity came with shame though, the weight of being someone who survived on other people's leftovers, the constant reminder that she had no place at any table. Iris knew about horses. Her father had worked with them before the drinking got bad, and in the good times before everything fell apart he'd taught her things that most people never learned. How to read their body language, the difference between fear and aggression, the way their ears told you what they were thinking before they moved. How to approach without threatening, how to be present without demanding, how to let them come to you instead of forcing yourself on them. Those lessons lived in her body now, muscle memory and instinct, and though she hadn't been near a horse since her parents died, the knowledge remained. She'd heard about Thunder, of course. Everyone in Crossroads had heard about the storm horse, the gray stallion that couldn't be broken and had put 2 men in the hospital. She'd heard Dale Kruger tell the story at the feed store, his voice loud and certain as he explained why the animal needed to be put down before it killed someone. She'd heard the kids at school talking about it in whispers that carried a thrill, the way people talk about monsters and legends. And she'd felt something stir in her chest when she heard those stories, a recognition she couldn't name but felt as surely as hunger. The sense that whatever made Thunder too wild for Crossroads was the same thing that made her too inconvenient to see. It was Thursday evening when Iris first saw him in person. She'd been cutting through the Henderson property on her way back to the mill, taking the long route to avoid Main Street where she'd seen Brett and his friends gathered outside the gas station. The sun was dropping toward the western hills, painting everything in shades of amber and gold, and the temperature was falling fast enough that her breath came in visible puffs. She heard him before she saw him, the rhythmic strike of hooves against metal carrying across the empty fields, and curiosity pulled her toward the sound the way it might pull anyone toward something they don't fully understand. She moved carefully through the tall grass that bordered the ranch, instinct keeping her low and quiet, until she reached the fence line and could see into the isolated corral where Thunder lived. The stallion was magnificent in a way that made her chest ache, powerful and furious and utterly alone in his steel cage. He was pacing the perimeter with his head high and his tail flagged, stopping every few circuits to slam his front hooves against the panels hard enough to make them ring. His coat caught the dying light and seemed to glow, and the lightning bolt mark on his face stood out stark white against gray. But it was his eyes that caught her, held her, made something inside her chest crack open. They were dark and wild and full of a rage that she understood completely because she carried the same fire inside herself, the fury of being trapped and hurt and misunderstood, of being seen as dangerous when really you were just desperate. Iris pressed herself against the fence and watched until the light failed completely and Thunder was just a moving shadow in the darkness. She watched the way he never stopped moving, couldn't stop, the restless energy of something that had given up hope of escape but refused to surrender. She watched the way his ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds she couldn't hear, always alert for the next threat. She watched the way he held his weight, favoring his left hind leg just slightly, a telltale sign of old injury that no one had probably noticed or cared about. And she made a decision that she couldn't explain to anyone, least of all herself, a decision that came from somewhere deeper than logic or self-preservation. She would come back. She would try. Because if no one else could see that Thunder wasn't evil or crazy but just scared and hurt and alone, then maybe she was the only one who could. Maybe saving him was the same as saving some part of herself that the world was determined to crush. The walk back to the mill took her through darkness that would have frightened her 2 years ago but now felt like the only honest thing about her days. At least the dark didn't pretend. At least it didn't look away. She climbed the rusted ladder to the loft and wrapped herself in her moth-eaten blanket, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead she lay staring at the shadows on the ceiling and thinking about the gray stallion with the lightning mark, about the way he moved like contained thunder, about the look in his eyes that mirrored something she saw every time she caught her reflection in a shop window. She thought about her father's lessons, about patience and presence and the language that existed between humans and horses when both were willing to listen. And she thought about the conversation she'd overheard at the feed store, Dale's voice cutting through the afternoon as he complained about the cost of keeping a useless animal through winter, about how Robert needed to make the hard choice and make it soon. Iris didn't know how soon was soon, but some instinct told her that time was measured in days not weeks, and if she was going to try this impossible thing she couldn't wait for perfect circumstances or permission that would never come. Friday morning came cold and gray. the sky pressing down low enough to feel like a ceiling. Iris went through her usual routine, checking the diner's back door where Grace had left half a sandwich and an apple with a soft spot, filling her water bottle from the creek, avoiding the routes where she was most likely to encounter trouble. But her mind was already at the Henderson Ranch, already planning. She needed to know Thunder's routine, when the ranch hands were nearby and when the corral was most isolated. She needed to understand the layout better, where she could approach from and where she might need to run if things went wrong. Most importantly, she needed to pick her moment carefully, because she'd only get one chance before someone caught her, and she'd lose any possibility of trying again. The day crawled past with the particular slowness that comes when you're waiting for something that frightens and compels you equally. She spent the afternoon hidden in a copse of cottonwoods that gave a clear view of Thunder's corral, watching the patterns. The ranch hands gave the area wide berth, none of them venturing closer than they absolutely had to for the twice-daily feeding that involved tossing hay over the fence and retreating quickly. Thunder charged the fence every time, a display of aggression that was really a display of terror. The performance of a creature that had learned violence was the only language people understood. By the time evening came and the ranch settled into its twilight quiet, Iris had her plan. She would wait until full dark, until the bunkhouse lights went out and the only sounds were wind and the distant lowing of cattle. She would approach from the north where the cottonwoods gave cover almost to the fence line. She would take no food, no treats, nothing that suggested transaction or bribery. She would simply come to him the way her father had taught her to approach any frightened animal, with empty hands and patient presence and the willingness to be rejected. And if Thunder killed her, well, at least it would be while trying something that mattered, which was more than she could say for most of her days. The darkness that settled over Crossroads that Friday night was the kind that only comes to places far from city lights, a blackness so complete it felt like a physical presence pressing against the skin. The moon was a thin crescent hanging low on the horizon, offering barely enough light to distinguish earth from sky, and the stars scattered overhead seemed cold and distant, indifferent witnesses to whatever happened below. Iris waited in her loft at the old mill, counting the hours by the church bell that rang every hour until 10 and then fell silent, leaving only the sound of wind moving through broken windows and the creek murmuring over stones. She tried to rest earlier, knowing she'd need her strength, but her body hummed with nervous energy that made stillness impossible. Instead, she'd organized her few possessions, folded the blanket and tucked it into the corner where she kept it, checked the laces on her worn sneakers 3 times, and run through everything her father had taught her about approaching frightened horses until the words became a kind of prayer. The church bell struck midnight, the sound carrying clear across the valley, and Iris knew it was time. She climbed down the ladder carefully, testing each rung before trusting it with her weight, and dropped the last few feet to the ground. The cold hit her immediately, sharp enough to make her gasp, and she pulled the too large flannel shirt tighter around herself even though she knew it wouldn't help much. The walk to Henderson Ranch took 20 minutes, following Willow Creek until it bent west and then cutting across the empty fields where summer wheat had been harvested and nothing remained but stubble. She moved carefully despite the darkness, placing each foot with precision, avoiding anything that might snap or rustle. The skill of staying unnoticed had become second nature over the past 2 years, the ability to move through space without disturbing it, and she called on every bit of that skill now. The ranch appeared as a collection of darker shapes against the dark landscape, the barn and outbuildings forming a rough cluster with the main house standing slightly apart, its windows all dark now except for a single light on the second floor that probably belonged to Robert and Patricia's bedroom. The bunkhouse sat quiet, no light showing, and Iris could hear snoring carrying faintly through its walls. She gave all the buildings wide berth, keeping to the fence line and using the scattered cottonwoods for cover, working her way north and then west until she reached the isolated section where Thunder's corral stood. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might be audible, and her hands trembled despite her attempts to steady them. Fear coursed through her, not of the horse but of being caught, of having this one chance ripped away before she could even try, of the shame that would come from being dragged off the property and forbidden to return. Thunder's corral rose before her, the steel panels darker gray against the black sky, and she could make out his form inside, a restless shadow moving back and forth. He hadn't settled for the night, probably never did, just paced endlessly in the cage that had become his entire world. Iris approached the fence slowly, making no attempt to hide the sound of her footsteps because announcing yourself was safer than surprising an animal already on edge. She stopped 3 feet from the steel panels and stood completely still, letting him register her presence, letting him process this new element in his controlled environment. Thunder's head shot up immediately, his ears pinning back flat against his skull, and he spun to face her direction. Even in the darkness she could see the tension in his body, every muscle coiled and ready, his breath coming in loud snorts that sent clouds of vapor into the cold air. Iris didn't move. She simply stood and breathed, in and out, slow and steady, trying to calm her own racing heart because horses could sense fear and panic and they responded to it with their own. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, patient and sure even through the fog of years. Let them come to terms with you on their timeline, not yours. Don't ask for anything. Just be there, consistent and quiet, until they decide you might not be a threat. She had no idea if Thunder would give her that chance, if his trauma ran too deep for patience to reach, but she had to try. The alternative was walking away and knowing she'd given up without even attempting to bridge the distance between them. Minutes passed, measured by her breath and his, by the wind pushing against her back and the gradual adjustment of her eyes to the darkness. Thunder remained at the far side of the corral, his body still taut with readiness, but he didn't charge. That alone felt like progress, the absence of immediate violence a kind of communication in itself. Iris shifted her weight slightly, testing, and his ears flicked forward for just a moment before flattening again. The movement was so brief she might have imagined it, but it gave her hope. She took one careful step to her right, parallel to the fence rather than toward it, non-threatening movement that showed she wasn't trying to corner or trap him. Thunder tossed his head, a sharp upward jerk that sent his mane flying, but his hooves stayed planted. Another minute passed, another adjustment of position. Iris found a spot where 2 fence posts met and created a narrow gap she could see through more clearly, and she lowered herself to the ground there, sitting cross-legged in the dirt and dead grass. The cold from the earth seeped through her jeans immediately, but she ignored it, keeping her focus on the gray shape across the corral. Sitting made her smaller, less imposing, changed the dynamic from confrontation to something else. It was a posture of vulnerability, of showing that she had no intention of forcing interaction, that she would meet him at whatever level he could tolerate. Thunder circled once, his path taking him closer to where she sat, and she caught the shine of his eye as he passed, assessing her. She kept her gaze soft, not making direct eye contact because that could read as challenge, just maintaining awareness of his position without staring. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of pine from the distant tree line and something sharper, the ozone scent that came before snow. Her fingers were going numb, but she kept them relaxed in her lap, resisting the urge to tuck them under her arms for warmth. Any sudden movement could undo whatever fragile progress existed. Thunder made another circuit, closer this time, and then stopped about 15 feet from where Iris sat. His head lowered slightly and his ears came forward, genuinely forward, not the brief flicker of earlier but sustained attention. He was studying her, trying to determine what she was and what she wanted, running her presence through whatever internal calculus horses used to evaluate threat and safety. Iris felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the intensity of being seen, truly seen, by another living being. It was something she'd been starved for, this acknowledgement of existence, and receiving it from a creature as damaged and wary as Thunder made it feel even more precious. She wanted to speak, to whisper reassurance, but she kept silent because words might break whatever was forming between them. This tentative thread of connection that felt more fragile than spider silk. The gray stallion took a step toward her, then another. His movements were careful, deliberate, each hoof placement a decision rather than unconscious motion. He stretched his neck out, nostrils flaring as he tried to catch her scent on the wind, and Iris saw the lightning bolt mark clearly now, a jagged slash of white that seemed to glow against his darker coat. She held perfectly still, barely breathing, as Thunder closed the distance between them until only the steel fence separated them. He stood there for a long moment, so close she could hear the air moving through his nostrils, could see the subtle movements of his muscles beneath his coat. Then slowly, almost tentatively, he lowered his massive head until it was level with hers, and they regarded each other through the gap in the fence panels. Iris felt something break open inside her chest, a sensation like ice cracking or a dam giving way, and the tears came freely now, sliding hot down her cold cheeks. This creature that everyone had written off as savage and unreachable was choosing to acknowledge her, was offering this moment of presence that no amount of force or dominance could compel. She raised one hand very slowly, telegraphing the movement, and extended it toward the fence with her palm open and empty. Thunder's ears flicked back and forth, uncertain, and for a moment she thought he might retreat. But instead he stretched his neck a fraction more and touched his muzzle to her fingertips through the gap. A contact so brief and light it might have been imagined except for the warmth of his breath against her skin and the soft velvet texture of his nose. The connection lasted only seconds before Thunder pulled back, tossing his head and stepping away as if shocked by his own boldness. But those seconds rewrote everything Iris understood about possibility. He hadn't attacked, hadn't struck or bitten or displayed the violence that everyone said defined him. He'd chosen gentleness, chosen curiosity over fear, chosen to meet her offering with one of his own. She lowered her hand back to her lap, not reaching for more, content with what had been given. Her father's voice echoed again. Always leave them wanting more contact, not less. End on a good note and they'll remember it. She had no idea if she'd have another chance. But if this was all she got, it was enough to prove that Thunder wasn't what everyone believed him to be. He wasn't broken or evil or beyond hope. He was scared and hurt and defending himself the only way he knew how, and underneath all that protective fury was a creature capable of connection if someone bothered to approach him with something other than dominance and violence. Iris sat with him for another hour, maybe more, time losing meaning in the darkness and cold. Thunder returned to pacing eventually, but his movements seemed less frantic, the rhythm of his hooves less urgent. Twice more he came close to where she sat, studying her from a distance that shrank each time, working through his wariness at his own pace. She spoke to him finally, when the silence felt ready to hold words, her voice barely above a whisper and shaped more like thinking out loud than conversation. She told him about the mill and the loft where she slept, about the cold that came through the broken windows and how she'd learned to curl tight enough to conserve warmth. She told him about her parents, what little she could remember through the blur of grief and time, her father's patient hands and her mother's rare laugh. She told him about being invisible, about moving through Crossroads like smoke through a room, noticed only when she became inconvenient. And she told him about the feeling she'd had when she first saw him, that recognition of shared experience, the understanding that they were both prisoners of other people's fear and assumptions. Thunder listened, or seemed to, his ears swiveling toward her voice even as he moved. There was no way to know how much he understood, if any, but that wasn't really the point. The point was the act of speaking, of offering her truth to him the way he'd offered his presence to her, of creating space where both of them could exist without pretense or performance. When she finally stood to leave, her legs cramped from sitting so long in the cold and her fingers completely numb, Thunder came to the fence one more time. He didn't touch her again, but he stood close, his dark eye catching what little light existed and reflecting it back, and Iris felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. She pressed her palm against the cold steel panel that separated them, wishing she could touch him properly, could run her hand along his neck and feel the life pulsing beneath his coat. But she knew that would come or it wouldn't, and forcing it would destroy everything they'd built tonight. The walk back to the mill passed in a blur of exhaustion and exhilaration, her body shaking from cold and emotion both. She climbed to the loft and wrapped herself in the blanket, but even after she'd stopped shivering she couldn't sleep, her mind replaying every moment of the encounter. Thunder's approach, his careful consideration, the brief touch of his muzzle to her fingers, the way his body had relaxed incrementally as the hour stretched, the way his breathing had evened out, the way he'd chosen to stay near her rather than retreating to the far corner of his prison. These things felt like gifts, precious beyond measure because they'd been freely given rather than taken or demanded. And underneath the joy of connection ran a current of desperation because she didn't know how much time remained before someone decided Thunder's fate. before the decision was made final and irreversible. Saturday morning arrived too quickly, gray light seeping through the mill's broken windows and bringing with it the kind of cold that ached in the bones. Iris woke stiff and exhausted, her body protesting every movement, but her mind was sharp with purpose. She needed to return to Thunder, needed to build on what they'd started, needed to prove that the connection was real and repeatable and worth preserving. But first she had to navigate the daylight world, had to scavenge food and avoid attention and not draw the kind of notice that would make people wonder what she'd been doing out all night. She made her way into town, moving through alleys and back ways, and found her way to the diner's back door where Grace had left the usual box. Today it held half a stack of pancakes wrapped in foil and going cold but still edible, and a container of orange juice that Iris drank so fast it made her stomach cramp. She was tucking the foil into her shirt pocket, too useful to discard, when she heard voices from the front of the diner, carrying through the screen door that separated the kitchen from the dining area. Male voices, familiar in that way voices became when you heard them often even if you'd never spoken to their owners. Dale Kruger's rasp, complaining about something, and then Robert Henderson's lower rumble in response. Iris froze, pressing herself against the wall beside the dumpster, and listened with every fiber of her being. The conversation was mundane at first, weather and cattle prices, but then Dale shifted topics with the smoothness of someone who'd been waiting for the right moment. "You called Doc Briggs yet about that gray?" Robert's response was quiet, reluctant. "This morning. She's coming at dawn tomorrow. Sunday." Dale grunted approval. "About time. That animal's been nothing but expense and danger since day one. You're making the right choice, getting it done before someone gets killed." The words hit Iris like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her vision tunnel. Dawn tomorrow. Sunday morning. Less than 24 hours. She'd known time was short, but hearing it stated so baldly, so casually, made it real in a way that threatened to crush her. She slid down the wall until she was sitting in the dirt beside the dumpster, her hands pressed over her mouth to keep from making any sound that might reveal her presence. 24 hours. One day. How could she possibly prove Thunder's worth, demonstrate his capacity for connection, make anyone see what she'd seen in a single night? The task felt impossible, the timeline cruelly short, but giving up wasn't an option she could tolerate. If Thunder died without her trying everything she could, she'd carry that failure forever, and she already carried enough weight without adding that burden. She waited until the voices moved away, until she heard the bell over the diner's door chime as Robert and Dale left, and then she ran. She ran without thought for who might see or what they might think, ran across Main Street and down the alley behind the hardware store, ran past the church where parishioners were starting to arrive for Saturday evening service, ran until she reached the edge of town and could cut across the fields toward Henderson Ranch. Her lungs burned and her legs ached and the cold air felt like knives in her throat, but she didn't slow until she reached the cottonwood grove north of Thunder's corral. She pressed herself against a tree trunk, gasping for breath, and forced herself to think rather than just react. Bursting onto the ranch in daylight when people were around would accomplish nothing except getting her thrown off the property and banned from returning. She needed to be smart, needed to wait for the right moment, needed to approach this with the same patience she'd shown Thunder the night before. The afternoon stretched into evening, the sun dropping toward the western hills and painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Iris watched the ranch from her hiding spot in the cottonwoods, tracking the movements of ranch hands as they completed their evening chores, feeding cattle and checking fences and moving equipment. She watched Thunder in his corral, pacing his endless circuits, and wondered if he remembered her from the night before or if she'd been just another confusing element in a world that had taught him to trust nothing. The temperature dropped as twilight deepened, frost forming on the grass around her feet, and still she waited. The bunkhouse lights came on, yellow rectangles in the gathering dark, and smoke rose from its chimney as the evening meal was cooked. The main house glowed warm, and Iris could see silhouettes moving past the windows, Patricia and Robert going about their evening routines with no idea that a desperate girl was freezing in their north pasture. Full darkness finally arrived, the same complete blackness as the night before, and Iris gave it another hour to make sure everyone had settled before moving from her hiding spot. Her muscles had gone stiff from cold and stillness, and the first few steps sent sharp pains through her legs. But she pushed through it and made her way to Thunder's corral. He was there, of course, always there because he had nowhere else to be, and when she approached the fence he lifted his head immediately. For a heart-stopping moment she thought he wouldn't recognize her, that the previous night's connection had been unique and unrepeatable. But then his ears came forward and he took 3 quick steps toward where she stood. Relief flooded through her so intensely it made her dizzy, and she dropped to the ground in the same spot as before, assuming the same posture, offering the same non-threatening presence. Thunder came to the fence faster this time, the caution of the previous night replaced by something that looked almost like eagerness. He stretched his neck through the gap between panels and exhaled hard, his breath warming her face, and Iris raised her hand slowly to let him touch her fingers again. The contact lasted longer this time, his muzzle soft and curious against her palm, and she felt the tremor that ran through him, fine as earthquake premonitions. She began to speak, her voice steadier now, telling him about what she'd overheard, about the 24 hours that was all they had, about how desperately she wanted to save him but didn't know how. The words poured out of her, confession and plea and promise all tangled together, and Thunder listened with his head lowered to her level, his dark eye fixed on her face. The night deepened around them, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns while Iris sat with Thunder and felt the weight of borrowed time pressing down on everything. She'd been talking for what felt like hours, her voice growing hoarse from the cold and from the effort of putting feelings into words, and Thunder had stayed near the fence, his presence steady in a way that made her chest ache. The gray stallion would shift his weight occasionally, favoring that left hind leg she'd noticed before, and once he lifted his head to look toward the bunkhouse when someone coughed loudly inside, but always his attention returned to her. It was the kind of focus that felt like being held, like being caught and supported at the same time, and Iris understood with sudden clarity why her father had loved working with horses. They offered something humans rarely did, a presence without judgment, attention without agenda, acceptance that didn't require you to be anything other than what you were. She told Thunder things she'd never told anyone, secrets she'd kept locked so deep inside herself she'd half forgotten they existed. About the night her parents died, how she'd been sleeping in the back of the camper when it happened and had woken to sirens and flashing lights and strangers asking questions she couldn't answer because her brain had simply stopped processing reality. About the foster home they tried to place her in first, where the other kids had stolen her mother's bracelet, the only thing she'd managed to keep, and how she'd run 3 days later with nothing but the clothes she wore. About the first winter on the streets when she truly believed she might freeze to death, when the cold had gotten so deep inside her bones that she'd stopped shivering and started feeling warm, which she later learned meant she'd been close to hypothermia. About the shame that came with begging, with digging through trash, with being the kind of person other people crossed the street to avoid. About the exhaustion of being constantly alert, always watching for danger, never able to truly rest because safety was a luxury she couldn't afford. Thunder listened to all of it, and something in his steady presence made Iris feel like maybe the things she carried weren't quite as heavy when shared, even if the sharing was with a horse who couldn't respond with words. She wondered what Thunder would tell her if he could speak, what stories lived behind his eyes, what memories haunted him when the night grew long and sleep wouldn't come. She could see scars on him now that her eyes had adjusted to the darkness, old marks on his shoulders and flanks that spoke of harsh treatment, of whips and spurs and the kind of training that broke spirits along with wills. There was a crescent-shaped scar on his chest that looked like it might have come from barbed wire, and his ears had small notches that suggested frostbite from some winter when shelter hadn't been adequate. These marks were a language she could read, a history written on his body, and they told her that Thunder's violence wasn't nature but response, wasn't who he was but what he'd learned to be in order to survive. She stood eventually, her body protesting the movement after sitting so long in the cold, and Thunder's head came up sharply as if alarmed by the change. Iris moved slowly, carefully, letting him track her motion as she approached the fence more directly. She'd been sitting off to the side, non-threatening in her positioning, but now she wanted to try something that scared her even as she felt compelled toward it. The gate to Thunder's corral was secured with a chain and 2 heavy padlocks, but there was a section of fence about 8 feet from the gate where the panels didn't quite meet flush, leaving a gap wide enough that someone small and determined might squeeze through. It would mean entering his space completely, putting herself at the mercy of an animal that had hospitalized two grown men, trusting that the connection they'd built would hold when tested. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was foolish, that she was risking everything on a bond that was barely formed, that one wrong move would end with her trampled or worse. But rationality hadn't gotten her through the past 2 years, and it wouldn't save Thunder tomorrow when Dr. Briggs arrived with her needle and her professional sympathy. Iris reached the gap in the fence and turned sideways, testing the space, and found she could just barely fit her shoulders through if she exhaled completely. Thunder watched her with ears pricked forward, his body tense but not aggressive, waiting to see what she would do. She looked at him across the 10 feet that separated them and made her choice. The same choice she'd been making since the first night. The choice to trust that underneath the armor of his fear was something worth reaching. She squeezed through the gap, feeling the cold steel scrape against her ribs and back, and emerged on the other side into Thunder's domain. The air felt different inside the corral, charged with possibility and danger both. And Iris stood very still while her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. Thunder stood motionless, his body coiled tight, every muscle visible beneath his winter coat. His nostrils flared wide, taking in her scent, and his eyes showed white at the edges. This was the moment that would determine everything, Iris realized. This was where he would either accept her fully or where his fear would override the tentative trust they'd built and he would see her as just another human coming to hurt him. She didn't move toward him, didn't reach out or make demands. She simply stood with her arms loose at her sides and her breathing slow and steady, offering him the choice of whether to close the distance or maintain it. The seconds stretched impossibly long, each one feeling like it contained entire lifetimes, and the cold bit into her exposed skin while she waited for Thunder to decide her fate. The gray stallion took a step toward her. Just one, testing, and then he stopped and studied her some more. Iris kept her gaze soft, not making direct eye contact but maintaining awareness of his position, reading his body language the way her father had taught her. Another step. Thunder's ears flicked back and forth, uncertain, and he stretched his neck out as far as it would go without moving his hooves, trying to investigate her from a distance. She could see his muscles trembling, fine shivers running beneath his coat that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the internal battle he was fighting between fear and curiosity. Another step, and now he was close enough that if he struck out with his front hooves he could easily reach her. Iris felt her breath catch but forced herself to remain still, forced herself to trust that he wouldn't, that whatever they'd been building through words and patience and shared presence would be enough to hold them both safe. Thunder lowered his head, bringing it down to her level, and exhaled hard enough that his breath stirred her hair. The white lightning bolt mark on his face was so close now that Iris could have touched it without extending her arm, could see the individual white hairs that formed the pattern and the way they stood out starkly against the darker gray. She raised her hand very slowly, telegraphing the movement, giving him every opportunity to move away if he chose. Her fingers trembled, from cold and fear and the magnitude of this moment, and she held her breath as she extended her palm toward him. Thunder's ears came forward, genuinely interested now rather than wary, and after a pause that felt eternal he pushed his muzzle into her hand. The contact was deliberate this time, not the tentative brush of the previous nights but firm pressure, and Iris felt tears spring to her eyes as she curved her fingers against the soft velvet of his nose. They stood that way for a long moment, girl and horse connected by touch and trust in the freezing darkness of a Montana night, and Iris felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been locked tight for 2 years suddenly opening like a flower deciding to bloom. Thunder leaned into her touch, his breath warming her cold fingers, and she began to stroke his face gently, letting her hand trace the line of his lightning bolt mark and then down to his jaw. His coat was coarser than she'd expected, thick with winter growth, and beneath it she could feel the warmth of his body and the steady pulse of his heartbeat. He was real and alive and choosing to accept her, and that choice felt like the most precious gift anyone had ever given her. She whispered to him words that barely qualified as words, more like sounds shaped by emotion than by meaning, telling him without telling him that she saw him, really saw him, not as the dangerous beast everyone else perceived but as the frightened survivor he actually was. Thunder shifted his weight, and for a moment Iris thought he might move away, But instead he took another step closer, closing the distance between them until his chest was nearly touching her shoulder. She could feel the heat radiating from him now, could smell the scent of horse that was somehow both earthy and clean, could hear the quiet sounds of his breathing and the slight creak of his body as he shifted. She moved her other hand up slowly and placed it on his neck, feeling the powerful muscles there, the ridge of his crest where his mane grew thick and tangled. Thunder allowed it, his head still lowered to her level, and Iris began to stroke his neck in long, slow movements that were as much for her comfort as for his. This was what she'd needed, she realized. Not just to save him, but to touch something living that didn't flinch away from her. To be close to another beating heart that wasn't repulsed by her existence. The loneliness she'd carried for 2 years felt suddenly less absolute, less permanent. Because Thunder was here and Thunder was real and Thunder had chosen her just as much as she'd chosen him. Time lost meaning again as she stood with him, her hands moving over his neck and shoulder, learning the geography of his body, finding the places where old injuries had left their marks. There was a patch on his right shoulder where the hair grew differently, probably scar tissue from some old wound, and when her fingers found it, Thunder tensed briefly before relaxing again. She murmured reassurance, her voice barely audible even to herself, and kept her touch gentle over the sensitive area. His left hind leg, the one he favored, drew her attention, and she wanted badly to examine it, to understand what caused his limp. But that would require moving to his hindquarters, and she knew instinctively that was too much too soon. The front half of a horse was where they could see you, where they felt most secure about your presence. Moving behind them required a level of trust that took time to build, and time was the one thing they didn't have. The thought of tomorrow, of Dawn and Dr. Briggs and the final needle, came crashing back into her awareness like a wave she'd been holding at bay, and Iris felt desperation claw at her throat. She had this moment, had Thunder accepting her touch, had proof that he could be gentle and trusting and everything the ranch hands said he wasn't. But none of that mattered if she couldn't show someone else, couldn't demonstrate to Robert Henderson or Dale Kruger or anyone with authority that Thunder deserved another chance. The impossibility of the task threatened to overwhelm her. What could she do? Drag someone out here in the middle of the night and hope Thunder would perform on command? Stage some kind of demonstration that would convince hardened ranchers to reverse a decision they'd already made? She was 12 years old and invisible, a girl nobody listened to or believed, and she was trying to save a horse that everyone agreed was beyond saving. The odds were so stacked against her that even attempting this felt absurd. But she'd learned something in 2 years of surviving on scraps and determination, something that Thunder had probably learned in his own way through whatever trials had shaped him. Sometimes the only choice was to try anyway, to push forward even when success seemed impossible, because the alternative was giving up, and giving up meant accepting that the world was right to see you as worthless. Iris pressed her forehead against Thunder's neck, feeling his warmth seep into her skin, and made a promise that she had no idea how to keep. "I won't let them kill you," she whispered into his coat. "I don't know how yet, but I won't let them." Thunder's ears swiveled toward her voice, and he stood very still, as if listening to the promise and weighing whether to believe it. She felt his breath stir her hair as he lowered his head over her shoulder, not quite embracing but close enough that it felt like protection, like shelter. And in that moment Iris knew that whatever happened tomorrow she would have to find the courage to stand between Thunder and destruction the way he was standing now between her and the cold, indifferent night. She stayed with him until exhaustion made her clumsy, until the cold had seeped so deep into her bones that her teeth chattered uncontrollably and her fingers had gone numb. Leaving felt like tearing something, like ripping fabric that wouldn't mend cleanly. But she knew she needed rest if she was going to function tomorrow, needed whatever warmth her threadbare blanket could provide and a few hours of sleep to clear her mind. Thunder followed her to the fence when she finally moved toward the gap she'd entered through, his hooves soft in the dirt, and when she squeezed through to the outside he pressed his muzzle through the gap and touched her hand one more time. The gesture felt like goodbye even though neither of them wanted it to be, felt weighted with the knowledge that tomorrow might steal all possibility of future contact. Iris wrapped her fingers around his muzzle for just a moment, feeling the warmth of his breath against her palm. And then she turned and walked away before the tears that were threatening could fall and freeze on her cheeks. The walk back to the mill passed in a blur of cold and exhaustion and racing thoughts. Her body moved on autopilot, following the route she'd memorized, while her mind spun through possibilities and discarded them one after another. She could try to talk to Robert Henderson directly, but he'd never listened to her before and had no reason to start now. She could attempt to gather witnesses, but who would come in the middle of the night to watch her interact with a supposedly dangerous horse? She could try to physically prevent Dr. Briggs from entering the corral, but that would just result in her being removed and probably arrested, accomplishing nothing except ensuring she couldn't try anything else. Every option felt inadequate, every plan flawed, and the weight of the impossible task pressed down on her shoulders until she felt like she might collapse beneath it. The mill appeared ahead, its broken silhouette darker against the dark sky, and Iris climbed the ladder to her loft with arms that shook from more than cold. She wrapped herself in her blanket and curled into the tightest ball she could manage, trying to conserve warmth, but her mind wouldn't settle enough for sleep. She kept seeing Thunder's face, kept feeling his muzzle in her palm, kept hearing the steady rhythm of his breathing and the soft sounds he'd made when she touched the scars on his shoulder. He trusted her, had opened himself to the possibility of connection despite every reason not to, and she couldn't bear the thought of that trust being betrayed by her failure to save him. The stars visible through the broken window seemed to mock her with their distance and indifference. Cold lights in a cold sky, and Iris closed her eyes against them and tried to find some path forward in the darkness behind her eyelids. Sleep came eventually, fitful and thin, full of dreams where she was running but couldn't move fast enough, where Thunder was calling but she couldn't reach him, where dawn arrived and she was still searching for the solution that would make everything right. She woke with a start when the church bell rang for 5 in the morning, the sound carrying clear across the valley in the pre-dawn stillness. Her body ached from the cold and from the tension she'd carried even in sleep, and her head felt thick and foggy from too little rest. But dawn was coming, dawn and Dr. Briggs and the end of everything if she couldn't find a way to stop it, and that knowledge cut through the fog like lightning through a storm cloud, sharp and clarifying. Iris threw off the blanket and climbed down from the loft, her movements sharp with purpose even though she still had no clear plan. She would go to the ranch, would put herself between Thunder and anyone who tried to hurt him, would make them see her even if they'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of looking away. It was a terrible plan, likely to fail, but it was all she had and so it would have to be enough. The cold morning air hit her as she emerged from the mill, sharp enough to make her gasp, and the sky to the east was just beginning to show the first hints of gray that preceded true dawn. She had maybe an hour, probably less, before Dr. Briggs would arrive and the decision would become irreversible. The run to Henderson Ranch burned through what little energy she'd managed to restore during her brief sleep, but Iris pushed her body past its protests, past the burning in her lungs and the stitch in her side, past the weakness that came from too many meals skipped and too many nights spent cold. She reached the ranch just as the bunkhouse lights came on, just as the ranch hands were beginning their day, and she didn't bother trying to hide or approach subtly. Instead, she ran directly to Thunder's corral, her footsteps loud in the morning quiet, and threw herself against the fence. Thunder was there, pacing as always, and when he saw her he came to the fence immediately, pressing his muzzle through the gap to touch her hand. The gesture was so full of recognition, so clearly a greeting between two beings who knew each other, that Iris felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. This connection was real, was valuable, was worth fighting for, and she would make someone see it even if she had to drag them to the fence by force. She heard voices from the direction of the main house, heard truck doors slamming and the sound of boots on gravel, and she knew time had run out. Dr. Briggs had arrived, probably with Robert and Dale, and they were coming to do what they'd decided needed doing. Iris looked at Thunder, at his dark eyes and his lightning bolt mark and the way he stood close to the fence as if he could sense her desperation, and she made her choice. She squeezed through the gap in the fence panels, the steel scraping her ribs raw, and emerged inside the corral just as the voices grew close enough for her to make out words. Thunder moved to stand beside her, so close his shoulder touched hers, and together they turned to face whatever was coming. The dawn came slowly to Crossroads, the sky shifting from black to charcoal to the pale gray that preceded sunrise, and with it came the sounds of the ranch waking. Robert Henderson emerged from his house with his hat pulled low and his shoulders set in the posture of a man about to do something he'd rather avoid. and beside him walked Dr. Ellen Briggs carrying a black medical bag that seemed to weigh more than it should. Dale Kruger was already at the barn, having risen early to prepare, and he joined them as they walked toward the isolated corral where Thunder had spent the last 8 months of his life. The morning air was sharp and still, the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned the ground hard as iron, and none of the three spoke as they crossed the distance to where the gray stallion waited for a judgment he couldn't understand. Dale saw her first, stopping so abruptly that Robert nearly walked into him from behind. "What the hell?" he said, his voice sharp with surprise and anger, and Robert followed his gaze to see something that made no sense, that violated every law of nature and safety. He understood about horses and especially about Thunder. Inside the corral, standing beside the stallion everyone had agreed was too dangerous to live, was Iris Whitman, the stray girl who'd been haunting the edges of his property for months. She stood close enough to Thunder that his shoulder touched hers, one hand resting against his neck, and the horse who'd put Jake in the hospital and nearly killed Dale stood perfectly calm beside her. His head lowered and his ears forward, the very picture of docile attention. Robert felt his breath catch in his chest, felt his understanding of reality shift sideways because what he was seeing simply wasn't possible. Thunder didn't stand calm for anyone, didn't allow touch, didn't do anything except rage and strike and defend his space with a violence that had seemed absolute. Yet here was this slip of a girl, barefoot despite the freezing ground and dressed in clothes that barely qualified as adequate, with her hand on the stallion's neck and the stallion accepting it as if they'd been partners for years instead of what had to be only days at most. Dr. Briggs made a small sound of surprise, her professional composure cracking enough to let shock through, and Dale swore under his breath, his face darkening with anger that looked like it might be covering fear. Iris saw them and her jaw tightened, her hand pressing firmer against Thunder's neck as if she could anchor him to her through will alone. Her voice when she spoke was thin from cold and exhaustion but carried clearly in the still morning air. "You can't kill him. Not now, not ever. I won't let you." The declaration would have been almost comical coming from a 12-year-old girl who weighed maybe 90 pounds and had no authority or power to back up her words, except for the fact that she stood inside a corral with a horse that had broken bones and ended careers, and that horse stood with her like a guardian rather than a threat. Robert found himself unable to respond immediately, his mind still trying to process the impossibility before his eyes, and in the silence Dale stepped forward with his hand already reaching for the gate chain. "Get out of there right now before that animal kills you," Dale barked, his voice carrying the authority of 12 years as foreman. But Iris didn't move and neither did Thunder. The stallion's ears flicked toward Dale's voice and his body tensed slightly, muscles rippling beneath his coat. But he didn't charge or strike or show any of the aggressive displays that had become his signature. Instead he shifted his weight slightly, a movement so subtle it might have been missed except that it placed his body more squarely between Iris and the men at the fence, a positioning that looked distinctly protective. Dale's hand froze on the chain, and Robert saw calculation move behind his foreman's eyes, the assessment of risk and the unwillingness to be the one who tested whether Thunder's apparent calm would hold if the gate opened. Robert stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. "How long have you been coming here?" The question was directed at Iris, and he saw her swallow hard before answering, her hand still pressed against Thunder's neck. 3 nights. This is the 3rd night. I've been sitting with him, talking to him, showing him that not everyone wants to hurt him." Her voice wavered but didn't break, and Robert heard in it the same desperate determination he'd heard in his daughter's voice years ago, when she'd begged him to save a litter of kittens someone had dumped by the road. It was the sound of someone who'd decided that this particular fight mattered more than safety or sense, and who would go down swinging rather than surrender. Dr. Briggs moved closer to the fence, her medical bag forgotten for the moment, her professional interest clearly piqued by what she was witnessing. "That's Thunder? The one who put 2 of your men in the hospital?" Her question was directed at Robert, but her eyes never left the stallion, studying his body language with the trained assessment of someone who'd spent 30 years working with horses. Robert nodded, unable to find words, and Dr. Briggs let out a low whistle of surprise. "He's not showing any signs of stress or aggression. Look at his ear position, his breathing, the way he's standing. That's not a horse in distress. That's a horse who's comfortable, who's chosen to be where he is." Dale made a disgusted sound, as if the doctor's professional opinion was somehow offensive to him. "It's a trick," he said flatly. "That girl's got something on her, some scent or drug that's keeping him calm. The minute she leaves, he'll go back to being the same devil horse he's always been." Iris's eyes flashed with anger, the first real emotion other than fear that Robert had seen on her face. "There's no trick. There's no drug. There's just patience and not treating him like he's something to be dominated. You all spent months trying to break him, trying to force him to submit, and all you did was make him more scared. I spent 3 nights showing him that I wouldn't hurt him, that I wouldn't demand anything from him, and he chose to trust me." She paused, her chest heaving with emotion, and when she spoke again her voice cracked. "He's not broken. He never was. He's just been terrified and fighting back the only way he knew how." Thunder shifted again at the sound of her distress, his head coming around to nose at her shoulder in a gesture that was unmistakably gentle, unmistakably concerned, and Robert felt something in his chest tighten at the sight of it. Patricia Henderson's voice came from behind them, making everyone jump slightly. "How long have you been planning to kill him without telling me?" Robert turned to find his wife standing there with her arms crossed and her expression caught between anger and hurt, and he realized she must have woken and found him gone and followed. "Patricia," he started, but she cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Don't Patricia me. I asked you a question." Robert sighed, feeling the weight of the decision and now the weight of his wife's disappointment. Doc Briggs was supposed to come at dawn, before the ranch hands started work. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd try to talk me out of it and I couldn't afford to be talked out of it. The horse is dangerous, Patricia. You know that." She shook her head, her eyes moving past him to the corral where Iris stood with Thunder. "That horse is traumatized and we failed him. We took him on and then treated him exactly the same way his previous owner did, with force and dominance and no patience. And now this child, this girl who has nothing, has shown us what we should have been doing from the start." Dale's face was red now, anger making his voice harsh. "You can't be serious. You're going to take the word of a street kid over months of experience? Over 2 men who got hurt trying to work with that animal?" Robert held up a hand to forestall further argument, his mind working through the implications of what he was seeing. The truth was undeniable, no matter how impossible it seemed. Thunder was calm, was accepting Iris's presence, was showing behaviors that directly contradicted everything they believed about him for 8 months. Either the girl had discovered something they'd all missed, or she possessed some quality that allowed her to connect with the stallion in a way none of his experienced ranch hands could. Either option suggested that killing Thunder now would be a mistake, would be ending a life that still held possibility if only someone bothered to approach it differently. He stepped closer to the fence, close enough that he could see the details of Iris's face, the hollows beneath her cheekbones that spoke of too many missed meals, the shadows under her eyes that told of cold nights and restless sleep, the determination in her jaw that reminded him painfully of his younger self when he'd been trying to save this ranch from bankruptcy after his father died. "Where have you been staying?" The question seemed to surprise her, as if she'd expected continued argument about Thunder rather than concern for her welfare. "The old mill," she answered after a moment's hesitation. "In the loft." Robert felt Patricia's sharp intake of breath beside him, and he knew his wife was thinking the same thing he was, that the mill was barely standing, that its loft was open to the elements, that no child should be spending Montana winter nights in a place like that. Dr. Briggs had moved to a different angle, studying Thunder from another perspective, and now she spoke with the authority of her profession. "Mr. Henderson, I've been a veterinarian for 30 years and I've seen a lot of horses in a lot of situations. What I'm seeing here is genuine trust, genuine bonding. This isn't a drugged horse or a temporarily calm horse. This is a horse who's formed an attachment to this girl and who's responding to her presence the way horses respond to herd members they trust. If you ask me to euthanize him now, I'll do it because that's what you hired me for, but I'll tell you straight that I think it would be a mistake. You've got something valuable here, something rare. Most horses that go as wrong as Thunder supposedly did can't come back from it. But he has, or he's starting to, and that's worth preserving." Dale made another disgusted sound, but Robert ignored him. His attention focused on Iris and Thunder, on the way the girl's hand rested so naturally against the stallion's neck, On the way, Thunder's body was angled toward her as if she were magnetic north and he was a compass finding his bearing. The sun was rising now, true sunrise rather than just pre-dawn gray, and golden light spilled across the ranch, illuminating the scene in the corral with a clarity that felt almost symbolic. Robert made his decision, the kind of decision that came from instinct rather than logic, from the part of him that still believed in second chances despite all the times he'd been proven wrong. "Thunder stays," he said, his voice firm enough that even Dale didn't dare argue immediately. "And so does the girl." Iris's eyes went wide with shock, tears spilling over before she could stop them, and Thunder shifted closer to her as if sensing her emotion. "Mr. Henderson, you don't have to," she started, but Patricia cut her off gently. "Yes, he does. You can't keep sleeping in that mill, child. Winter's coming hard and you'll freeze. We've got space in the house, a room that's just sitting empty, and we've got work you can do to earn your keep." She paused, her voice softening further. "And it seems Thunder's going to need someone who actually knows how to work with him. Someone he trusts. That's you, whether we like it or not." Dale finally found his voice again, sputtering with indignation. "This is insane. You're going to let some stray kid live here and work with a dangerous horse? What happens when he goes back to his old ways and hurts her? What happens when she fails and we're back to square one?" Robert turned to face his foreman, and something in his expression must have communicated finality because Dale actually took a step back. "Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But right now, what I'm seeing tells me that we've been approaching this wrong from the start, and this girl's figured out something we missed. I'm willing to give them both a chance, and that's the end of the discussion." Dale's jaw worked as if he wanted to say more, but after a moment he spun on his heel and stalked away toward the barn, his body language radiating fury. Dr. Briggs began packing up her bag, relief evident in her movements. "I'll send you a bill for the call-out, but honestly I'm glad I didn't have to do what I came here to do." She paused at the gate, looking back at Iris. "Take care of him and take care of yourself. What you've done here is remarkable." Iris nodded, still crying, and Dr. Briggs left, her truck starting up and pulling away while the sun climbed higher and the morning grew bright and cold. Patricia moved toward the corral gate, working the chain loose. "Let's get you out of there and into a hot shower and some proper food. You look half frozen and completely exhausted." Iris squeezed through the fence gap one more time, moving slowly, and Thunder followed her to the edge, pressing his muzzle through to touch her hand in what had clearly become their ritual. Robert watched as his wife led the girl toward the house, watched as Iris kept looking back at Thunder until they were out of sight, and he felt the weight of his decision settle over him like a familiar coat. He'd just committed to housing a child who had no legal connection to them, to keeping a horse that had cost him thousands in damages and injuries, to fundamentally changing how his ranch operated based on nothing more than what he'd witnessed in a single morning. It was possibly the most impractical decision he'd made in 20 years of ranching, and yet somehow it felt right in a way that defied explanation. He looked at Thunder, who stood watching the direction Iris had gone with an intensity that looked almost human in its longing, and Robert spoke quietly to the stallion. "You'd better be worth it. You'd better prove that what we saw today wasn't just some fluke." Thunder's ears flicked toward his voice and the stallion turned to look at him directly, and for just a moment Robert could have sworn he saw something in those dark eyes that looked like understanding, like acknowledgement of the reprieve that had just been granted and the responsibility that came with it. Then Thunder turned and walked to the far side of his corral, lowering his head to the hay that had been thrown over the fence earlier, and Robert headed back toward the house where he could already smell coffee brewing and knew Patricia would have questions that would take most of the morning to answer. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the dawn cold, and Crossroads began another day with no idea that something fundamental had just shifted on the Henderson ranch, that an impossible bond between a forgotten girl and a condemned horse had rewritten rules everyone thought were fixed, and that sometimes the most valuable things came from the places people had stopped looking. The hot water from the shower felt like a revelation, almost painful against skin that had been cold for so long that warmth registered as a kind of burning. Iris stood under the spray with her eyes closed and let the heat sink into her bones, watching dirt and grime swirl down the drain in brown spirals until the water finally ran clear. Patricia had left clean clothes folded on the bathroom counter, jeans that were close to the right size, and a soft sweater that still smelled like laundry detergent. And when Iris finally emerged from the steam, she barely recognized her reflection in the mirror. Her hair hung wet and clean down her back, darker now without the coating of dust. And her face looked different somehow, younger maybe, or just less worn. She dressed quickly, her fingers clumsy on the buttons because she'd grown and used to clothes that actually fit properly, and emerged from the bathroom to find Patricia waiting in the hallway with a kindness in her eyes that made Iris want to cry all over again. The kitchen table was set with more food than Iris had seen in one place in 2 years: scrambled eggs and bacon and toast with butter and jam, orange juice in a glass pitcher that caught the morning light, and Patricia gestured for her to sit while she poured coffee for herself and cocoa for Iris. "Eat slowly," Patricia said gently. "Your stomach's probably not used to a full meal, and I don't want you getting sick." Iris nodded and tried to follow the advice, but hunger made restraint difficult, and she found herself eating faster than she meant to, shoveling food into her mouth until Patricia reached over and placed a hand on her arm. "Slow down, honey. The food's not going anywhere, and there's plenty more if you're still hungry after." The gentleness in her voice, the casual endearment, the simple acknowledgement of her presence at this table, all of it combined to overwhelm Iris's fragile composure, and she found herself crying into her eggs, while Patricia moved around the table to wrap her in the kind of hug that Iris hadn't felt since her mother died. They sat that way for a long time, Patricia holding her while she cried out 2 years of loneliness and fear and exhaustion, crying until her chest ached and her throat was raw, and there was nothing left inside except a hollow feeling that was somehow better than the fullness of grief. When the storm finally passed, Patricia pulled back and handed her a napkin to wipe her face. "Better?" Iris nodded, not trusting her voice, and Patricia squeezed her shoulder before returning to her own chair. "Now," she said, her tone becoming more businesslike though still warm, "we need to talk about what happens next. You can't just live here unofficial-like. Not with winter coming, and certainly not long-term. We'll need to contact social services, get things sorted properly." Iris felt panic spike through her chest, her body tensing to run, and Patricia must have seen it, because she held up both hands in a calming gesture. "I know that probably scares you, and I understand why after what you've been through. But Robert and I have been talking, and if you're willing, we'd like to see about becoming your foster parents. Make this official and legal so you've got a real home, not just a place you're staying until someone decides otherwise." The words didn't make sense at first, seemed too good to be true in a way that made Iris suspicious because nothing in her experience had prepared her for adults who actually wanted her around. "You want to foster me?" Her voice came out small and uncertain. "But you don't even know me." Patricia's smile was sad and understanding. "We know enough. We know you're brave enough to stand between a dangerous horse and the people trying to kill him. We know you're resourceful enough to survive 2 years on your own. We know you've got a gift with animals that most people never develop. And we know that right now you need a home and we have one to offer. The rest we can figure out as we go." Iris wanted to believe it, wanted so badly to accept this impossible gift that was being offered, but 2 years of disappointment had taught her to be cautious. "What about Thunder? If I live here, can I keep working with him?" Patricia laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Honey, I don't think we could stop you if we tried. That horse has made it pretty clear that you're his person now, and honestly, you might be the only chance he's got at becoming something other than dangerous. So yes, working with Thunder is part of the deal, as long as you're safe about it and you let Robert or me know what you're doing." The conversation continued through breakfast, Patricia explaining how the fostering process would work, how they'd need to contact the county office and file paperwork, how there would be interviews and home visits, how it might take a few weeks to make everything official, but in the meantime Iris could stay with them and start settling in. They talked about school, which Iris hadn't attended in 2 years, and Patricia made it clear that education wasn't optional, but also that they'd work with the district to get her caught up without overwhelming her. They talked about chores and expectations, about the rhythms of ranch life and where Iris might fit into them, about the fact that living here meant being part of a family which came with responsibilities but also with support. It was the most anyone had talked to Iris rather than at her or around her in longer than she could remember, and she found herself slowly relaxing into the conversation, beginning to believe that maybe this wasn't a trick or a temporary kindness that would be snatched away. After breakfast, Patricia showed her the room that would be hers, a small space on the second floor with a window that looked out toward Thunder's corral in the distance. The bed had a real mattress and clean sheets, the closet was empty and waiting for whatever clothes they could gather for her, and there was a desk against one wall with a lamp and a chair. "It's not fancy," Patricia said, "but it's warm and it's dry and it's yours for as long as you need it." Iris walked to the window and pressed her hand against the glass, looking out at the ranch spread below, at Thunder's corral where she could just make out the gray shape of him pacing, and felt something settle in her chest that might have been peace or might just have been the absence of constant fear. "Thank you," she whispered, and Patricia came to stand beside her. "You don't have to keep thanking us. You're going to earn your place here through work, and believe me, ranches don't run themselves. We're getting as much out of this arrangement as you are." The rest of that first day passed in a blur of newness and adjustment. Robert came in from the morning's work and sat down with Iris to talk about Thunder, about what she'd observed in her 3 nights with him, about what she thought might help him continue to progress. Iris found herself explaining things she hadn't known she understood, about how Thunder's aggression was really fear, about how his violence was a defense mechanism that had been reinforced by every human interaction he'd had before her, about how the key to reaching him wasn't domination but patience and the willingness to let him set the pace of their relationship. Robert listened with an attention that felt both flattering and intimidating, taking notes occasionally and asking questions that showed he was actually interested in her perspective rather than just humoring her. When she mentioned the limp in Thunder's left hind leg, his expression sharpened. "I noticed that 2 months ago, but every time we tried to examine him, he'd nearly take our heads off. You think you could get close enough to check it?" Iris considered, thinking about how Thunder had let her touch his neck and shoulder, but how she'd instinctively known not to move toward his hindquarters yet. "Maybe," she said slowly. "Not today, probably not tomorrow, but if we keep building trust, eventually he'll let me. Give me a week." That afternoon Iris went back out to Thunder's corral, this time through the front gate that Patricia unlocked for her rather than squeezing through the gap in the fence. Thunder came to her immediately, pushing his muzzle into her hands, and Iris felt her chest expand with something that felt dangerously close to joy. She spent an hour just being with him, talking softly about everything that had happened that morning, about the shower and the food and the room with a window, about Patricia and Robert and the possibility of staying. Thunder listened the way he always did, ears swiveling toward her voice, occasionally snorting or shifting his weight, but mostly just present in that complete way horses had of being fully in the moment. She examined his body more thoroughly than she'd been able to in the darkness, running her hands over his neck and shoulders, finding more scars, more evidence of rough treatment, more reasons why he'd learned to defend himself with violence. The crescent scar on his chest that she'd noticed before looked like it had been deep once, probably painful, and when her fingers traced it, Thunder tensed but didn't pull away. "Good boy," she murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you. I promise I'm never going to hurt you." The days that followed established a pattern that began to feel like routine, like the structure of a life rather than just survival. Iris woke in the morning to Patricia's call for breakfast, ate at the kitchen table with Robert and Patricia like she was actually part of the family, and then spent several hours with Thunder. She worked slowly, never pushing, letting him show her what he was ready for. By the end of the first week, he was allowing her to move along his entire left side, her hands traveling from his shoulder to his flank, though he still tensed when she approached his hindquarters, and she respected that boundary. By the end of the second week, he was lowering his head when she approached, a gesture of trust that made her throat tight every time, and he'd started following her around the corral like a giant dog, his hooves soft behind her as she moved. The ranch hands watched from a distance, their expressions ranging from amazement to skepticism, but even Dale had stopped making snide comments after he'd seen Thunder standing calm while Iris cleaned mud from his hooves, a task that would have been impossible a month ago. Patricia contacted social services and the process of official fostering began, complete with interviews and paperwork and a home visit from a caseworker who seemed surprised to find Iris clean and well-fed and living in an actual room rather than a mill loft. The caseworker asked questions about Thunder, concern evident in her expression, and Iris explained carefully that working with the horse was teaching her responsibility and patience, that it gave her purpose, that she was never alone with him without someone on the ranch knowing where she was. The caseworker seemed satisfied, or satisfied enough, And when she left, she indicated that she'd recommend approval of the foster placement pending final review. Patricia hugged Iris after the woman drove away. "We're going to make this official," she said. "You're going to be ours, at least for now, and we're going to be yours." The words settled into Iris's chest and took root there. Fragile still, but growing stronger. School was harder than Iris had anticipated. 2 years away from formal education, having left gaps in her knowledge that made her feel stupid and behind. The other kids stared when she arrived that first day, whispers spreading about the stray who was living at Henderson Ranch now, and Brett and his friends made comments just loud enough for her to hear about charity cases and pity projects. Iris kept her head down and tried to focus on the work, but the social dynamics of middle school were their own kind of survival challenge, and she found herself eating lunch alone, sitting at the far end of a table while everyone else clustered in groups that had been formed years ago and had no space for newcomers. Only one person approached her that first week, a girl named Autumn Mitchell, whose father ran a smaller spread on the other side of Crossroads. Autumn sat down across from Iris without asking permission and announced that she'd heard about what happened with Thunder and thought it was the coolest thing ever. "You actually got inside his corral?" Autumn's eyes were wide with admiration. "My dad says that's the bravest or stupidest thing he's ever heard of, and I told him it was definitely brave." Autumn became Iris's first real friend, a connection that formed easily because Autumn didn't care about social hierarchies or popularity. She just loved horses and loved that Iris was working with one as challenging as Thunder. She started coming out to Henderson Ranch after school, watching Iris work with the stallion, asking endless questions about technique and approach, occasionally helping with other ranch chores while Iris focused on Thunder. The two girls formed the kind of friendship that's built on shared interests and genuine liking rather than convenience, and Iris found herself experiencing something she'd almost forgotten existed: the simple pleasure of having someone who wanted to spend time with her not because they needed something but just because they enjoyed her company. Autumn talked about her own horses, about her dreams of training professionally someday, about the challenges of being a girl in a world that still expected ranching to be men's work, and Iris listened and shared her own tentative hopes about maybe working with rescue horses, about maybe helping other animals that had been written off the way Thunder had been. By the middle of November, a month after that dawn morning when everything had changed, Iris had made enough progress with Thunder that she felt ready to attempt examining his injured leg. She'd been working up to it gradually, moving her hands further down his flank each day, letting him get used to her presence near his hindquarters, building trust in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. Robert had been patient, checking in regularly but not pushing, and Patricia had been quietly supportive, making sure Iris ate properly and rested enough and didn't pour so much of herself into Thunder that she neglected her own well-being. Dr. Briggs had come out twice to observe, professional interest overcoming any embarrassment about the euthanasia call that hadn't happened, and she'd offered advice about how to approach the physical examination when Iris felt Thunder was ready. "Horses remember pain," Dr. Briggs had explained. "If that leg was injured badly enough to cause a permanent limp, he's probably got strong negative associations with anyone touching it. You'll need to be patient and probably work through some fear response when you get to the actual injury site." The day Iris decided to try, the sky was low and gray with the promise of snow that hadn't fallen yet but felt inevitable. She entered Thunder's corral through the gate that had become routine, and Thunder greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, pushing his muzzle into her hands and blowing warm breath across her palms. She spent 20 minutes just being with him, stroking his neck and talking softly about nothing in particular, letting him settle into her presence before she attempted anything new. Then she began moving her hands down his left side, past his shoulder and along his ribs, down toward his flank where his coat was thicker with winter growth. Thunder tolerated this easily now, so accustomed to her touch that he barely tensed, and Iris felt her confidence grow. She moved her hands lower, down toward his stifle, and felt him shift his weight slightly. "Easy," she murmured. "I've got you. I'm not going to hurt you." Her fingers traced down his leg, feeling the bones and tendons beneath the coat, searching for the source of his limp. She found it about halfway down his cannon bone, a swelling that was subtle but definitely present, heat radiating from the area that suggested old inflammation that had never properly healed. When her fingers pressed gently against the swelling, Thunder's whole body went rigid, his head shooting up and his ears pinning back. Iris froze but didn't remove her hand, keeping her touch light and steady. "I know it hurts," she said softly. "I know, and I'm sorry, but I need to understand what happened, so we can help you." Thunder trembled, every muscle taut, and for a moment Iris thought he might strike out, might revert to the violence that had been his primary language for so long. But instead he exhaled hard and lowered his head again, not quite relaxed but accepting, and Iris felt tears prick her eyes at the trust that gesture represented. She examined the leg as thoroughly as she dared, feeling the extent of the swelling, noting how Thunder flinched when she touched certain spots but held still despite the obvious discomfort. When she finally stepped back and released his leg, Thunder immediately shifted his weight off it, confirming what she'd suspected. Whatever injury he'd sustained, it hadn't healed properly and was probably causing him constant low-level pain. Robert was waiting at the fence when Iris emerged, and she explained what she'd found. "He's got significant swelling in his left front cannon bone. Probably an old injury that wasn't treated properly and healed wrong. That's why he's been so aggressive, at least partly. He's been in pain this whole time, and every time someone tried to force him to do something, they were making it worse." Robert's jaw tightened, and Iris could see anger moving behind his eyes, though she didn't think it was directed at her. "I'll call Doc Briggs, have her come out to do a proper examination now that he'll actually let someone near him. If it's something we can treat, we will. If it needs surgery, we'll figure that out too." The commitment in his voice, the casual way he said "we" as if it were obvious that Iris would be included in decisions about Thunder's care, made her feel like maybe she really did belong here, like maybe this wasn't temporary but something that could last. Dr. Briggs came the next day and confirmed what Iris had found, explaining that Thunder had probably suffered a severe bowed tendon at some point that had been left untreated and had healed with significant scar tissue. The pain probably flares up with exercise or stress, which would explain why he's been so reactive. Every time someone pushed him, tried to work him hard, they were literally hurting him and he was defending himself. The good news is that with proper treatment, anti-inflammatories, and controlled rest, we can reduce the pain significantly. He'll always have a limp, but he doesn't have to live with constant discomfort. The examination itself was remarkable mostly because Thunder allowed it, standing mostly calm while Dr. Briggs palpated his leg and manipulated the joint, occasionally shifting or pinning his ears but never striking or trying to bite. The veterinarian kept shaking her head in amazement. "I've seen some transformations in my career, but this one's something special. This horse was scheduled for euthanasia a month ago, and now he's standing here letting me examine an injury that probably would have gotten me killed trying to touch it back then." Treatment began immediately, medications mixed into Thunder's feed twice daily, and Iris watched carefully for signs of improvement. Within a week, the swelling had decreased noticeably, and within 2 weeks Thunder's limp was less pronounced, his movements easier. The change in his temperament was even more dramatic than the physical improvement. As the constant pain eased, the hair-trigger aggression eased with it, and Thunder began to show personality traits that had been buried under layers of fear and hurt. He started to play, tossing his head and prancing when Iris entered the corral, kicking up his heels and generally acting like the young stallion he actually was beneath all the trauma. He became curious about things, investigating new objects Iris brought into the corral with interested snorts rather than aggressive displays. And he became genuinely affectionate, resting his head on Iris's shoulder while she stood with him, making soft sounds when she scratched his favorite spots, following her around like she was the center of his universe. The first snow came in early December, fat flakes that fell silent and steady until the world was covered in white, and the temperature dropped low enough that breath froze in crystalline clouds. Iris woke in her warm room and looked out at the transformed landscape, seeing beauty in the winter that had terrified her the previous year when she'd faced it from the mill loft with nothing but a moth-eaten blanket. Patricia called her down to breakfast, and they ate together while Robert stomped snow from his boots and complained good-naturedly about frozen water pipes. After breakfast, Iris bundled up in the winter coat Patricia had bought for her, proper insulated outerwear instead of the inadequate flannel she'd survived in before, and made her way to Thunder's corral. The stallion was standing in the falling snow looking like a statue carved from storm clouds, white flakes catching in his mane and dusting his back. And when he saw her, he came to the gate with his ears forward and his expression as close to happiness as a horse could manage. Iris had been working toward something, building toward a moment that felt both inevitable and terrifying, and she decided that this snow-quiet morning was the right time to try. She entered the corral and spent a few minutes greeting Thunder properly, checking his leg, which was still warm but less swollen than it had been, and then she stepped back and simply looked at him. Thunder looked back, his dark eyes intelligent and questioning, and Iris took a deep breath. She placed her hand on his shoulder, then moved to stand beside him, facing the same direction he was facing. Slowly, giving him every chance to move away, she gripped a handful of his mane and prepared to pull herself onto his back. This was the ultimate test of trust, the moment that would prove whether everything they'd built was strong enough to hold under pressure. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Patient horses choose to carry weight. They're never truly broken into it, and she sent a silent prayer that Thunder would choose to carry her. She pulled herself up in one smooth motion, swinging her leg over his back and settling gently onto him, and for a heart-stopping moment Thunder stood completely still, processing this new sensation. Iris barely breathed, her hands tangled in his mane, every muscle in her body ready to slide off if he panicked. Then Thunder took a single step forward, testing his balance with her weight, and when the sky didn't fall and nothing hurt, he took another step. Iris felt tears freezing on her cheeks as Thunder began to walk around the corral, his movements careful but not fearful, accepting her presence on his back the way he'd learned to accept her presence beside him. She didn't try to guide him, didn't ask for anything beyond what he was willing to offer, just sat quietly and let him carry her through the falling snow while the world watched in silent amazement. Robert and Patricia had come out of the house when they'd seen what was happening, standing at the fence with their arms around each other, and Iris could see them even through the snow, could see Patricia's hand pressed to her mouth and Robert's uncharacteristically emotional expression. Autumn had arrived for her usual after-school visit and was frozen at the fence, her eyes huge, and even Dale had emerged from the barn to witness something he clearly didn't want to believe but couldn't deny. Thunder carried Iris around the corral 3 times, each circuit a little steadier than the last, and when he finally stopped, Iris slid off and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her face into his mane while he stood calm and patient beneath her weight. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it. Everything they said was impossible, we just did it." The story of what had happened spread through Crossroads faster than the snow accumulated, growing with each retelling until it took on the quality of legend. The girl who'd lived on the streets had tamed the untamable horse, had proven that patience and understanding could accomplish what force and dominance never could, had ridden bareback through falling snow on a stallion that had been scheduled for death. People started coming to Henderson Ranch to see for themselves, cars slowing at the gate, visitors asking permission to watch Iris work with Thunder. Robert and Patricia established visiting hours, not wanting their ranch to become a circus but understanding that what Iris and Thunder had accomplished was rare enough to be worth sharing. Iris found herself demonstrating her techniques, explaining her approach to curious ranchers and horse owners, talking about trust and trauma and the importance of treating animals as individuals rather than problems to be solved. It was terrifying at first, being the center of attention after 2 years of being invisible, but Autumn stood beside her during these demonstrations and Patricia was always nearby, and gradually Iris learned how to speak with authority about the things she'd discovered through working with Thunder. The social services approval came through in mid-December, official papers that made Iris Whitman a legal foster child of Robert and Patricia Henderson, with the possibility of adoption to be discussed after a year if everyone agreed it was the right move. Patricia cried when the papers arrived, happy tears that she didn't bother trying to hide, and Robert pulled Iris into an awkward hug that meant more because it was so clearly out of his comfort zone. "You're ours now," he said gruffly. "No more mill lofts, no more scrounging for food, no more being invisible. You're a Henderson, or at least you're becoming one, and that means something around here." Iris nodded against his shoulder, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat, and felt Thunder's presence like a steady heartbeat in the back of her mind, the connection between them invisible but unbreakable. Christmas came, and with it the first real celebration Iris had experienced in years. Patricia insisted on decorating the house, dragging Robert and Iris into helping her string lights and arrange evergreen boughs, and on Christmas morning there were presents under the tree with Iris's name on them. Nothing extravagant, practical things like warm clothes and good boots, but also books about horse training and a journal with a leather cover that Patricia said was for recording her work with Thunder. Iris gave them presents she'd made herself, drawings of the ranch that she'd worked on secretly in her room. Rough but earnest attempts to capture the place that had become home. Patricia framed them immediately, hanging them in the kitchen where everyone could see, and Iris felt something in her chest expand with the kind of pride that comes from creating something valued. After presents, they went out to the barn together, and Iris spent Christmas afternoon with Thunder, braiding his mane with red ribbons that Autumn had brought over and telling him about everything that had happened, about how impossible it all seemed, about how grateful she was that he'd chosen to trust her when he had every reason not to. The winter deepened and the work continued, Iris splitting her time between school and the ranch, between homework and horse training, between her old life's survival skills and her new life's possibilities. Thunder's transformation continued as well, the aggressive stallion of 8 months ago becoming almost unrecognizable in the gentle giant, who now greeted visitors with curious snorts instead of violent displays. Dr. Briggs declared his leg healed as well as it was likely to get, the pain managed enough that he moved easily, and she suggested that light work might actually be beneficial for keeping the joint mobile. Iris began working with Thunder on basic ground manners, teaching him to lead properly, to stand for grooming, to accept having his hooves picked out, all the fundamental skills that should have been taught when he was young but had been skipped or brutalized out of him. Thunder learned quickly, his intelligence obvious once fear stopped blocking his ability to process information, and Iris found herself falling more deeply in love with him with each passing day, not just for what he'd done for her but for who he was becoming as he healed. By the time spring arrived, melting the snow and turning the Montana prairie green again, Henderson Ranch had changed in ways that went beyond just one horse and one girl. Robert had officially renamed the place Haven Ranch, acknowledging that its purpose had expanded beyond simple cattle ranching to include rehabilitation and rescue. 2 more horses had arrived, both with behavioral issues stemming from abuse or neglect, and while Iris was too busy with school and Thunder to work with them full-time, she consulted on their cases and helped develop treatment plans. Patricia had started documenting everything, taking photos and videos, writing down Iris's techniques and approaches, talking about maybe publishing something someday that could help other people working with traumatized horses. Autumn had become a regular fixture at the ranch, learning from Iris and helping with the new rescues, dreaming about the day when she might run a similar operation on her own family's land. Even Dale had softened, not exactly warm but no longer hostile, occasionally asking Iris questions about horse behavior that suggested he was actually listening to her answers. The anniversary of that dawn morning when everything changed arrived in early November, marking a full year since Iris had stood in Thunder's corral and refused to let them kill him. Robert and Patricia had suggested a small celebration, inviting Dr. Briggs and Autumn's family and a few others who'd been part of the journey. And as the guests arrived, Iris found herself standing at Thunder's fence and remembering everything that had happened in 12 months. The cold and fear of that morning felt distant now, like a story about someone else, though she knew it was real and would always be part of her. Thunder came to the fence and pushed his head over the top rail, and Iris reached up to stroke his face, her fingers tracing the lightning bolt mark that had given him his name. "We saved each other," she told him quietly. "Everyone thinks I saved you, but really you saved me just as much. You gave me a reason to fight when I'd almost given up, and you showed me that being seen was possible even when I thought I'd learned to be invisible." The celebration was simple and warm, people gathering in the barn while Patricia served apple cider and cookies, everyone taking turns sharing their favorite memory of the past year or their observations about how much both Iris and Thunder had changed. Dr. Briggs talked about the professional satisfaction of seeing a case she'd been prepared to euthanize instead become a teaching example of rehabilitation done right. Autumn talked about how Iris's friendship had changed her understanding of what was possible with horses and with people. Robert spoke briefly about taking chances on things that looked impossible and being reminded that sometimes the most valuable things came from the least expected places. And Patricia simply said that gaining a daughter had been the greatest gift of her life, that watching Iris bloom from a scared street kid into a confident young woman had been a privilege beyond measure. When it was Iris's turn to speak, she found herself struggling for words adequate to the moment. But finally she managed to say thank you, to everyone who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, to Thunder for being brave enough to trust again, to Robert and Patricia for seeing her when everyone else had perfected looking away. As evening fell and the guests departed, Iris made her way out to Thunder's corral one last time. The November air was sharp with the promise of winter, just like it had been a year ago, but everything else was different now. She had a home, a family, a future that extended beyond just surviving to the next day. She had friends and purpose and the kind of security that let her plan for things months in advance instead of just hours. And she had Thunder, whose steady presence had been the foundation everything else was built on, whose choice to trust her had changed both their lives in ways neither could have predicted. She entered the corral and Thunder came to her immediately, lowering his head so she could wrap her arms around his neck. And they stood that way while the stars came out overhead and the temperature dropped and the world settled into the quiet of approaching night. Iris thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, cold and scared and certain she was worthless. And she thought about the girl she was becoming, someone with value and voice and the power to create change. The distance between those two versions of herself was measured in more than just time, was marked by every small choice to keep trying, to keep believing that impossible things might be possible if you were stubborn enough and patient enough and willing to stay even when everything told you to run. Thunder shifted his weight and exhaled warm breath against her neck, and Iris smiled into his mane. Tomorrow she'd ride him again, longer this time, maybe even out into the pastures beyond his corral. Tomorrow she'd start working with one of the new rescues that had arrived last week. Tomorrow she'd go to school and sit with Autumn at lunch and turn in the essay she'd written about rehabilitation and second chances. Tomorrow there would be chores and homework and all the mundane details of a life that wasn't spectacular but was hers, solidly and completely hers in a way nothing had been for 2 years. But tonight, right now, she just wanted to stand with Thunder and remember where they'd started and acknowledge how far they'd come and hold space for the gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her when she let herself really feel it. They were both survivors, both fighters, both creatures who'd refused to let the world's judgment become their truth. And together, in ways neither could have managed alone, they'd built something worth keeping, something worth celebrating, something that would last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.